Donald Trump found himself cornered by a voice he had underestimated. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her tone, didn't pound the table, didn't need to. Her question sliced through the moment like a blade, precise and devastating. And in that instant, the mask of confidence Trump had worn for decades began to tremble. For the first time, he wasn't just dodging. He was stalling, blinking, visibly shaken. The timing made it even more explosive. America was reeling from the sudden death of Charlie Kirk, a polarizing figure whose influence loomed large in conservative spaces. His passing had sent shockwaves through the political landscape, igniting grief in some corners, denial in others, and opportunism in far too many. Trump, ever the showman, believed he could seize the moment, step forward as the loudest voice in the room, and bend sorrow into his own spectacle. But he hadn't planned for Crockett. He hadn't imagined that grief could also sharpen resolve, that pain could crystallize truth, and that someone would stand against his opportunism with surgical precision. The opening exchange was electric. Crockett's eyes steady, her words deliberate. She framed her challenge not as a personal attack, but as a moral reckoning. Trump leaned back, smirk flickering, trying to muster the old bravado. But the cameras betrayed him. The pause stretched too long. The smirk faltered. Viewers at home didn't need a pundit to tell them what they were seeing. The former president rattled, exposed, cornered by dignity itself. And yet, this was only the first blow. The atmosphere shifted. You could almost hear it, the crowd murmuring, journalists scribbling furiously, the country itself leaning closer to the screen. Trump had walked into the room expecting applause lines and deference. Instead, he faced an opponent who carried not just her own voice, but the echo of millions who had grown tired of his arrogance. Crockett stood there composed, relentless, the embodiment of what he could never mimic: authenticity. The world thought they had seen Trump spar with enemies before. They thought they knew his tricks, his insults, his rehearsed outrage. But no one was prepared for what came next. But what Crockett asked next would leave Trump and his supporters utterly speechless. The nation was still raw. Charlie Kirk's sudden death had struck like lightning, sending a jolt through the veins of conservative America. For his followers, it was grief mingled with disbelief. Vigils sprang up online, hashtags trended, and sympathetic voices called for respect and mourning. But in the darker corners of politics, the tragedy was seen less as a moment of collective grief, and more as a stage on which opportunists could posture, spin narratives, and tighten their grip on a fractured base. At the center of that opportunism stood Donald Trump. Trump knew the spotlight had returned to him. He sensed the vacuum Kirk's absence created and rushed to fill it. Yet his words carried no grace, no humility, no shared humanity. Instead, they dripped with calculation. He positioned himself as the heir to Kirk's fervor, a self-anointed guardian of a movement. But the tone was unmistakable. This was less about honoring the dead and more about reviving his own clout. For many watching, it was a painful reminder of how politics can strip dignity from even the most solemn occasions. And then came Jasmine Crockett. She entered the conversation not to score points, but to honor something deeper. Where Trump saw a microphone and an audience to exploit, Crockett saw a nation wrestling with its conscience. Her presence shifted the balance instantly. She spoke not only for herself, but for millions who had lost faith in performative politics, millions tired of arrogance dressing itself up as leadership. In her voice, there was both grief and conviction, and unshakable belief that America deserved better than theatrics in the shadow of tragedy. This was why the moment mattered. It wasn't simply about a clash of personalities. It was about the soul of American discourse. In the glare of cameras, Trump attempted to turn death into propaganda. Crockett, by contrast, refused to let the silence of mourning be desecrated. By challenging him, she wasn't just confronting a man, she was confronting a system of arrogance that fed on pain and division. The stakes grew clearer by the minute. For Trump, every word from Crockett was a threat to his control of the narrative. For Crockett, every smirk and dodge from Trump was evidence of how far he had fallen from dignity. And for viewers at home, the contrast was riveting. They weren't just watching a confrontation, They were watching a mirror held up to America itself. Would the country side with exploitation disguised as strength, or with dignity clothed in truth? What happened next was the ignition point. Viewers leaned forward, unable to look away, sensing that the tension was about to burst into something historic. Crockett's questions carried weight not only because of what they exposed in Trump, but because of what they demanded from everyone listening. In those exchanges, the audience was no longer passive. They were implicated. They were being asked to choose, to see through the hollow theatrics, or to remain blind. And yet, this was only the beginning. Crockett had landed blows that pierced the surface, but she was only warming up. The air was charged, the atmosphere thick, and Trump's defenses were already buckling. What no one realized was just how fragile his veneer of control truly was. Viewers had no idea the showdown was about to escalate in ways never seen before. To understand why Trump crumbled, we have to pull back the curtain on his long-standing contradictions. Donald Trump has always thrived on spectacle. His brand was built on bluster, not substance, on the ability to dominate a headline rather than demonstrate humility. From the moment he descended that golden escalator, his rise was fueled less by ideas than by insults, less by service than by self-promotion. Time and again, he made arrogance his calling card, dismissing critics as weak, branding opponents with derisive nicknames, and turning every platform into his personal stage. To his base, it looked like strength. To those outside the bubble, it was theater at the expense of truth. But now, in the shadow of Charlie Kirk's death, the cracks in that armor of arrogance began to show more than ever before. The contradictions in Trump's record were glaring. He claimed to be the voice of forgotten Americans, yet his policies disproportionately benefited the wealthy. He promised to drain the swamp, only to surround himself with insiders, lobbyists, and those who could feed his ego. He painted himself as a man of faith. But when moments of genuine compassion were needed, his words rang hollow, transactional, rehearsed. Over and over he had shown the world what truly drove him. Not country, not community, but himself. And in the days following Kirk's passing, Trump's instinct to exploit tragedy spoke louder than any tribute. Instead of pausing to reflect, he launched into self-serving declarations. He spoke less of Kirk's legacy and more of his own role as the movement's savior. He attempted to reframe grief as loyalty, as if the only way to honor Kirk's life was to rally behind Trump's ambitions. For those already grieving, it felt callous. For those watching closely, it revealed the emptiness at the core of his politics. The solemnity of death was reduced to just another backdrop for his performance. This is where the outrage sharpened. Even those who had once tolerated his theatrics could not ignore the insensitivity. When people mourn, they seek sincerity. They look for leaders who can offer a hand, a word, a moment of shared humanity. What they got instead was opportunism dressed as leadership. Trump was not mourning Kirk. He was marketing himself. The contrast with Jasmine Crockett could not have been starker. Where Trump exploited grief, she honored it. Where he sought to dominate, she sought to dignify. And it was this authenticity that turned the tables. Trump's corruption wasn't only moral, it was systemic. His career was riddled with bankruptcies spun as victories, scandals spun as conspiracies, and failures spun as fake news. He had an uncanny ability to rewrite reality in his favor, but only as long as people agreed to play along. The problem was, Crockett refused. She did not bend to his theatrics. She did not shrink under his glare, and in doing so, she exposed the hollowness of the persona he had so carefully crafted. For Trump, being challenged wasn't new, but being challenged by someone who could strip away the spectacle and lay bare the truth that was a threat he had not anticipated. Consider the history. When journalists pressed him, he dismissed them as enemies of the people. When rivals on stage cornered him, he drowned them in insults. When investigations loomed, he cried witch hunt. His strategy was always the same: attack, deflect, dominate. Yet the question Crockett poised herself to ask would not bend under those tactics. It would not be deflected or dismissed. It would force him into the one place he feared most: vulnerability. And that fear was already surfacing. His smirk in those first moments was a shield. his silence a stall. The man who prided himself on always having the last word suddenly looked like he was grasping for it. The crowd could sense it, the cameras captured it, and Crockett, calm and unflinching, prepared to press forward. This was no ordinary exchange. This was the unraveling of an image built on decades of bravado. It was arrogance that had carried Trump this far, but arrogance also made him blind. Blind to the sincerity of grief, blind to the hunger for authenticity, blind to the power of a question asked not in anger, but in truth. For once the stage was not his to control, and that loss of control was more devastating than any insult ever thrown his way. The contrast was damning. On one side stood a man who twisted tragedy for gain, hollow in his performance, clinging to a script of self-praise. On the other stood a woman who understood that leadership isn't about spectacle, but about service. That moment of contrast lit the fire under the confrontation to come. Trump had built his career on bluster, but Crockett's poise revealed just how fragile that foundation really was. And as America leaned in, eager to see if the strong man could survive the weight of his own contradictions, a new realization dawned. Arrogance could no longer shield him. But while Trump built his image on bluster, Crockett's story reveals why she could pierce through with a single question. Jasmine Crockett's journey to this moment was not paved with privilege or ease. It was forged in fire, the kind of fire that comes from being underestimated, dismissed, and pushed aside, only to rise stronger and more determined with every step. Long before she stood across from Donald Trump, Crockett had faced battles that would have broken those without her resolve. And it was those battles that gave her the composure to stare down arrogance without flinching. Born into a working-class family, she knew the language of sacrifice. Her parents taught her the value of hard work, the dignity of service, and the importance of standing tall even when the odds were stacked against her. These lessons were not abstract ideals but daily realities. She carried them into her education, where she excelled not because the path was smooth, but because she refused to stop climbing. In law school, she sharpened the tools she would later use in politics: a relentless eye for truth, a voice unafraid of confrontation, and a sense of duty to those who had no microphone of their own. Her legal career became the crucible of her character. Defending clients who could not afford power, she witnessed firsthand how the system bends for the wealthy and punishes the poor. In courtrooms, she faced prosecutors and judges who doubted her, sometimes because of her youth, sometimes because of her identity, often because of her refusal to conform. Each time she responded not with theatrics but with facts, with preparation, with the quiet thunder of someone who knew she had truth on her side. That resilience would later translate seamlessly into the political arena, where bluster often outweighs substance except when someone like Crockett enters the room. When she stepped into politics, the pattern repeated. Opponents dismissed her as too unpolished, too direct, too unwilling to play the game. But her refusal to bend became her strength. She wore her identity proudly. As a black woman, as someone rooted in community, as someone unafraid to confront power. For every insult hurled her way, she answered with dignity. For every attempt to silence her, she found another platform to speak. Slowly, the nation began to take notice. She wasn't simply participating in politics. She was redefining what authentic leadership looked like. This authenticity was not a performance. It was lived experience. When Crockett spoke of inequality, it was not from a detached podium, but from memory. When she spoke of dignity, it was not abstract. It was the echo of her parents' sacrifices, the voices of clients she had defended, the struggles of communities she had served. This is what made her dangerous to someone like Trump. He could fake empathy, but he could never replicate the grounding of lived truth. He could deliver applause lines, but he could not embody the authenticity Crockett carried with every word. What separated her from others who had challenged Trump was not just policy, but presence. She was calm under fire, immune to the theatrics he so often used to rattle opponents. When he smirked, she did not flinch. When he raised his voice, she held hers steady. When he dismissed, she redirected. It was not about matching his arrogance with more arrogance. It was about refusing to let arrogance define the terms of the exchange. That calmness, that refusal to play his game, made her both unpredictable and unstoppable. Her identity, once framed as a weakness by detractors, became her greatest weapon. Every struggle she endured gave her a perspective Trump could never access. Every insult she had weathered steeled her resolve, and every victory she had earned without shortcuts gave her credibility that no amount of wealth or bluster could purchase. She stood not just as Jasmine Crockett, politician, but as a representative of millions who had walked similar paths of dismissal and resilience. When she spoke, those millions heard their own voices echo back. And so, when the confrontation with Trump arrived, she was uniquely prepared. It wasn't just another debate, another clash of egos on camera. For Crockett, it was the culmination of years spent facing down power that underestimated her, the culmination of a life that had trained her to stand calm while storms raged. She was not there to win a headline. She was there to embody dignity itself. And that, more than any talking point or slogan, was what unsettled Trump. The audience watching may not have known her full story, but they felt it in the weight of her words. They sensed it in her steady gaze, in the way she asked her questions with precision instead of venom, with conviction instead of bluster. They recognized authenticity when they saw it, and in that recognition, the polarity between hero and villain became undeniable. Trump had the microphone. Crockett had the truth. And truth carries a resonance that spectacle can never match. This was why the stakes of their clash rose beyond politics. It wasn't about two individuals locked in verbal combat. It was about what kind of leadership America would choose to honor. Would it be the leadership of arrogance, opportunism, and hollow performance? Or would it be the leadership of authenticity, resolve, and dignity hard-earned through struggle? Crockett stood as living proof of the latter. And that proof could not be faked, could not be denied. And so the stage was set. Crockett, the fighter for truth, the calm under fire, the embodiment of dignity, was ready. Trump, the showman, the opportunist, the man of contradictions, was already rattled. The world was watching, the tension mounting, and the collision was inevitable. And when the confrontation came, the tension in the room was unbearable. The confrontation did not erupt all at once. It built slowly, like storm clouds gathering on a humid afternoon, an uneasy tension that everyone in the room could feel. At first it seemed like just another political exchange. Trump throwing out familiar lines, Crockett calmly countering. But underneath the words, there was something different. The rhythm was off for Trump. He was used to setting the tempo, keeping opponents on their heels, drowning them in noise. This time, he was the one scrambling to keep up. Crockett leaned into her questions with surgical precision. Each one was sharp, deliberate, leaving no easy exit. She didn't match Trump's volume or theatrics she didn't need to. Her power came from restraint, from the calm cadence of someone who knew the truth was enough. Every time he tried to interrupt, she paused just long enough for the silence to sting, then continued, unbothered. The effect was devastating. The crowd noticed. The cameras noticed. And most importantly, Trump noticed. He lashed out, trying to claw back control. The insults came, crude and familiar, questioning her intelligence, mocking her tone, sneering at her presence. It was the same playbook he had used 1,000 times before. But Crockett did not bite. She refused to be dragged into the mud. She held steady, her eyes fixed, her voice unwavering. The more he swung wildly, the more she appeared composed, almost serene. The contrast was unbearable to watch, yet impossible to turn away from. The audience shifted in their seats. Murmurs grew louder, then quieted again as the tension mounted. The journalists scribbled frantically, sensing history in the making. Every camera lens zoomed tighter, capturing beads of sweat forming on Trump's brow, the twitch of his jaw, the restless tapping of his fingers on the podium. His bravado was cracking, and the cracks were visible to the entire nation. Crockett's words carried a rhythm of inevitability, each statement built upon the last, cornering him, leaving fewer exits, fewer places to hide. She asked questions that reached deeper than politics, questions that demanded accountability, questions that exposed contradictions he had buried under years of slogans and bluster. And as the weight of those questions settled, Trump began to stumble. His answers grew shorter, more defensive. His voice, once booming with certainty, wavered ever so slightly. The silence between exchanges was almost as powerful as the words themselves. Each pause after Crockett spoke seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the whole room were waiting for Trump to summon an answer he didn't have. He shifted in place, forced to fill the void with rambling, with tangents, with recycled phrases that no longer carried the same force. What once made him seem untouchable now made him appear desperate. Crockett, meanwhile, remained unshaken. Her poise became the heartbeat of the room, steady and unyielding. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Her composure did the work for her. The crowd leaned forward not when Trump blustered, but when Crockett spoke. The cameras lingered on her not when she attacked, but when she paused, letting the weight of truth hang heavy in the air. In that contrast, the roles of hero and villain crystallized. The showman was unraveling. The steady fighter was rising. The escalation wasn't just verbal, it was visceral. You could see it in the shifting body language of those on stage, in the narrowing eyes of reporters, in the way the nation itself seemed to hold its breath. This was no longer political theater, it was a reckoning. Crockett wasn't just debating, she was exposing. And Trump wasn't just arguing, he was crumbling. The suspense reached its peak. The back and forth had transformed into something more profound. A duel between arrogance and dignity, between performance and authenticity. Every second that passed made it clearer who was in control and who was losing it. Crockett's calm presence had become a force unto itself, a mirror reflecting the fragility of the man who once projected invincibility. And then, just as the air seemed too thick to bear, she leaned in with a look that signaled the storm was about to break. The crowd hushed completely, every eye fixed on her, every microphone straining for the next words. Then came the question, a question so devastating it would strip away Trump's entire facade. The room was silent, so silent that you could hear the faint hum of the cameras, the shuffle of a notepad, the breath caught in people's throats. Jasmine Crockett held that silence like a conductor holds a baton, letting it build until anticipation became unbearable. Then she delivered it, the question. Precise. Surgical. A line crafted not as an insult, not as theater, but as a demand for truth that pierced straight through the armor Trump had worn for years. "Mr. Trump," she said evenly, her voice unshaken, "if you claim to honor the memory of Charlie Kirk, then why has every tragedy in this country always been turned into a stage for your self-promotion? When will you ever make it about the people, and not about yourself?" The words hung heavy, almost visible in the air. Trump's smirk faltered. His mouth opened, then closed again. For a man who prided himself on never being caught off guard, the pause was devastating. Seconds passed longer than any pause he'd ever allowed before. The crowd stirred. A few gasps rippled through the room. It was as if the nation itself leaned closer to the television, waiting to see if the king of deflection had finally met a question he couldn't outrun. Trump stammered. "Well, look, nobody has done more." "More for people, okay? Nobody." He shifted on his feet, his hands gesturing wildly. Charlie was a great guy. Everybody loved him, and I've always been very supportive. The most supportive, more than anyone. But the rhythm was gone. The swagger was gone. Every word sounded less like conviction and more like scrambling. Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't even shake her head. She just stood there calm, letting his unraveling play out in front of millions. It was restraint as strategy. Every extra second Trump rambled only deepened the sense that his power was slipping away. The cameras captured every flicker of uncertainty in his face, every darting glance, every bead of sweat sliding under the stage lights. And the audience knew it. In living rooms across the country, people shouted at their screens. Some laughed, others clapped, still others whispered, "Finally!" On social media, clips of the pause, the stumble, the ramble exploded in real time. Hashtags sprang to life. Crockett crushed him. Mic drop moment. Truth over Trump. Within minutes, the question had been replayed, remixed, and shared by millions. Memes of Trump's stunned expression flooded timelines. Side-by-side edits of his smirk dissolving into confusion became viral shorthand for arrogance meeting its match. Back in the room, Trump tried to rally. "Nobody respects Charlie more than me, believe me. I've always been the best at showing respect." But the words rang hollow. Respect isn't something you can declare into existence. Respect is seen, felt, lived. And in that moment, the contrast between his hollow declarations and Crockett's poised sincerity could not have been clearer. She wasn't just asking a question, she was holding up a mirror, and what reflected back was devastating. The tension tightened further when Crockett followed up not with venom, but with quiet insistence. The American people are tired of speeches about yourself. They're tired of their grief being used as your backdrop. Don't you think they deserve better? Again, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calmness cut deeper than any shout could. Trump's shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, but his words, once weapons, now sounded defensive, brittle, desperate. The crowd knew it too. You could see it in their eyes, in the way they leaned forward. Not toward Trump's podium, but toward hers. She had taken the stage without force, and now she owned it. Every glare he shot her way only reinforced the power imbalance. She was unmoved. He was unraveling. Journalists whispered to one another, already knowing the headline, "Crockett leaves, Trump speechless." Commentators scribbled notes, their expressions betraying the thrill of witnessing a shift in real time. For years, Trump had cultivated an aura of invincibility, a sense that no one could truly pin him down. But with one question delivered without theatrics, without venom, Jasmine Crockett had stripped that away. What was left was not strength, but fragility. Social media lit up further. Celebrities tweeted their support. "That's how you do it," one wrote. "Crockett just gave us the moment we've been waiting for." Activists clipped the exchange into TikToks that spread by the thousands. On Instagram, the still frame of Trump frozen mid-stammer became the defining image of the night. People weren't just watching. They were participating, amplifying, turning the moment into a movement. Trump's attempts to regain control fell flat. Each sentence seemed to collapse under its own weight. He gestured wildly, reaching for applause lines that never landed, for slogans that had long since lost their sting. The man who once dominated stages now looked like a performer searching for lines he'd forgotten. And Crockett? She stood silently, her expression calm, her presence unwavering, the embodiment of a truth that needed no embellishment. For those who had doubted her, who thought she would fold under the pressure, the moment was a revelation. Here was a leader not interested in spectacle, but in accountability. Here was someone willing to say aloud what millions had been thinking, that grief deserves dignity, not exploitation. That leadership is about service, not self-promotion. And in that instant, she wasn't just challenging Trump, she was redefining what it meant to stand tall in American politics. The mic drop was not in volume, but in clarity. She had exposed him, not with rage, but with resolve. And the power of that resolve reverberated far beyond the walls of that room. Every pause, every stumble, every faltering word from Trump was replayed in endless loops, proof that arrogance can crumble when faced with dignity. When the exchange finally ended, it wasn't Trump walking away with the spotlight. It was Crockett. She had taken the chaos he thrived on and replaced it with calm accountability. She had left the audience not with confusion, but with clarity. And Trump, the man who had once thrived on bending reality, was forced to stand in the glare of a truth he could not bend. The room buzzed, but it was different now. No longer was it the hum of anticipation, it was the roar of realization. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The strongman had been exposed, not by louder bluster, but by a question that revealed his emptiness. Crockett had not just won the exchange, she had rewritten the script. And yet, as monumental as that moment was, the story was far from over. What unfolded in the hours and days that followed would prove even more seismic. The ripple effect reached far beyond the walls of that debate stage. It spilled into headlines, timelines, and living rooms across the nation. But the story didn't end in that room. The ripple effect would shake the nation. The moment Jasmine Crockett's question landed, the shockwave spread instantly, leaping from the debate stage to the glowing screens of millions. Within minutes, clips of Trump stammering were everywhere looped, remixed, slowed down to highlight the falter in his voice, the blank in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. The internet had seized its prize, a rare, undeniable moment of Donald Trump visibly rattled, and it was Crockett who had delivered the blow. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, every platform lit up at once. The hashtag Crockett crushed him shot to the top of trending lists. By the hour's end, it was joined by others. One truth, over Trump, one question, and the devastatingly simple, speechless. Memes poured in at a dizzying pace. One showed Trump's frozen face captioned with the words, "Loading, answer not found." Another overlaid the clip with a boxing announcer shouting, "And he's down!" Young creators stitched reactions of themselves, gasping, cheering, even crying, replaying the moment as if it were a championship game-winning shot. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was culture. Politicians reacted quickly. Progressive leaders praised Crockett as the voice America needed, the rare figure who could cut through noise with unshakable clarity. One senator tweeted, "That's what courage looks like. That's what dignity sounds like." On the other side, conservative commentators scrambled to spin, insisting Trump had been caught off guard or showing respect in silence. But the images betrayed them. His smirk dissolving, his confidence leaking away, his words collapsing mid-sentence. Spin could not erase what millions had already seen with their own eyes. Celebrities joined the chorus. Musicians, actors, athletes, people with no political stake retweeted the clip with their own words of admiration. "This is the kind of leadership I want my kids to see," wrote one actor. "A woman standing firm in truth while a bully crumbles." A famous singer posted simply, "Mic dropped." Every share multiplied the reach. Every endorsement amplified the power of the moment. Crockett's name, once mostly known within political circles, was suddenly on the lips of millions who had never heard it before. She had become a symbol, a stand-in for dignity facing down arrogance. Commentators on late-night shows wasted no time turning Trump's stammer into punchlines. Monologues replayed the clip, each host delivering their own riff on the pause, the stumble, the hollow attempt at recovery. The laughter was relentless, and with each retelling, the humiliation deepened. Trump, who had built a persona on dominating attention, now found himself mocked by it. The very spotlight he craved had become a weapon against him. Meanwhile, Crockett's composure was hailed as extraordinary. Op-eds described her as a new kind of political force, one who could disarm without shouting, dismantle without cruelty. Editorials praised her as the embodiment of what America longs for, a leader who doesn't perform, but simply stands in truth. Grassroots organizers shared her clip at rallies, saying, "This is why we fight." In immigrant communities, her resolve was celebrated as proof that dignity can triumph even against towering arrogance. In classrooms and community centers, her name was suddenly invoked as an example of strength. The ripple effects extended globally. International outlets picked up the story, running headlines like, "Trump shaken by rising star," and "Crockett delivers blow heard around the world." Foreign commentators marveled at the image of America's former president silenced, not by scandal or investigation, but by the poised words of a determined congresswoman. It wasn't just a domestic story anymore. It was a symbol of shifting tides. For Trump, the humiliation deepened with every replay. Analysts dissected the moment frame by frame, pointing out his faltering voice, his nervous gestures, the rare look of uncertainty in his eyes. The man who once seemed untouchable was suddenly a study in fragility. His defenders tried to reframe it, but the sheer virality of the exchange made denial impossible. The narrative had already been written, and it was Crockett's to own. And yet, amidst the chaos, Crockett herself refused to gloat. In interviews, when pressed about how she had destroyed Trump, she shifted focus back to the people, back to the values at stake. She reminded audiences that the question wasn't about her versus him, but about what America deserves in its leaders: honesty, service, and respect for grief. While the internet crowned her a hero, she redirected the crown toward the collective, insisting that her voice was only powerful because it carried the weight of millions longing for dignity. It was that humility, that refusal to bask in the spotlight, that elevated her even further. She wasn't just the woman who rattled Trump, she was the leader who reminded the nation that leadership is not about spectacle. And in that reminder, she turned a viral moment into a moral one. But the frenzy was far from over. The memes, the hashtags, the headlines, they were only the beginning of a cultural earthquake. Because in the middle of laughter, cheers, and outrage, Crockett knew the real battle wasn't about one exchange on a stage. It was about reshaping the conversation entirely. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, Crockett refused to make it just about her. In the days that followed, as the dust of viral frenzy began to settle, Jasmine Crockett refused to let the moment calcify into just another political spectacle. She redirected the narrative with quiet insistence, reminding everyone that her confrontation with Trump was never about scoring points, never about personal triumph. It was about truth. It was about dignity. It was about the kind of future America chooses to build when faced with grief, division, and arrogance. In interviews, she spoke with the same calm composure she had shown on stage. When journalists pressed her to describe how it felt to humiliate Trump, she gently corrected them. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about the American people who are tired of being spoken over, tired of being exploited, tired of leaders turning their pain into theater. It's about showing that we deserve better, and we can demand better." Her words cut through the noise, transforming the viral clip into something larger than a trending hashtag. The contrast between Crockett's resolve and Trump's collapse became symbolic. It wasn't just one politician versus another, it was a parable for the nation. On one side, arrogance, selfishness, the hollow performance of a man who could not see past his own reflection. On the other, dignity, calm, and truth, embodied in a woman who stood tall without theatrics. The symbolism resonated because it spoke to something deeper than politics. It touched the moral core of what it means to be American. For communities long ignored or dismissed, Crockett's steadiness was validation. For immigrants who had been told they didn't belong, her poise was proof that their stories mattered. For young people watching politics with growing cynicism, her victory over arrogance showed that authenticity could still break through. And for anyone who had ever been shouted down, silenced, or mocked, her presence became a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. It can stand quietly, unyielding, and still win. As the clip continued to circulate, teachers played it in classrooms as an example of composure under pressure. Parents showed it to their children as proof that bullies can falter when faced with truth. Activists replayed it at rallies as fuel for movements that demanded accountability and justice. Crockett's voice had become more than her own. It was a vessel for the dignity of millions. And in that, the lesson crystallized. Dignity outlasts arrogance. Authenticity outshines spectacle. Truth dismantles bluster. Crockett's calm dismantling of Trump wasn't just a political win, it was a moral one. A declaration that America does not have to be defined by its loudest voices, but by its truest. The story no longer belonged to the debate stage. It belonged to every person who watched and felt something shift inside themselves. It belonged to those who suddenly believed, even if only for a moment, that justice could triumph over corruption, that resilience could silence arrogance, that Americanness itself could still be defined by service and compassion rather than self-promotion. Crockett framed it perfectly in one of her closing interviews. "We can't control what tragedies come our way. We can't choose whether grief visits our communities. But we can choose how we respond. Do we exploit, or do we honor? Do we divide, or do we heal? That's the choice in front of us." Her words lingered because they were more than political rhetoric, they were moral truth. They were a challenge not only to Trump, but to every American watching. And as the country reflected, the contrast between her authenticity and his unraveling became a guiding metaphor for the crossroads ahead. The moment had started as a clash between two figures. It ended as a lesson about who we are and who we could be. Crockett's resolve had stripped arrogance bare and revealed the strength of dignity. The question now was no longer just for Trump. It was for all of us. Which leaves us with one final question. Will America choose dignity or arrogance? One question. That was all it took. In a single moment, Jasmine Crockett shattered the illusion of invincibility that Donald Trump had built his entire career upon. What millions witnessed wasn't just a political takedown, it was the exposure of hollow arrogance when confronted by unshakable truth. Trump, the self-styled strongman, crumbled under the weight of a question he could not answer. And Crockett, calm and composed, stood as the embodiment of dignity in the face of bluster. This is why the moment matters. It wasn't simply about one debate, one clash, or one viral clip. It was about the universal truth that arrogance cannot withstand authenticity, that self-promotion collapses before service, and that dignity will always carry more power than cruelty. Crockett didn't just win an argument. She reminded America of what it can be when its leaders choose humility over ego, compassion over exploitation, truth over lies. Now the question is bigger than Trump, bigger than Crockett, bigger than any single stage. It belongs to all of us. Which America will we choose, the one that mocks grief and exploits tragedy, or the one that honors sacrifice and uplifts resilience? Crockett's stand was not just hers alone. It was a reflection of the millions who believe our nation deserves better, who know that true strength comes not from spectacle, but from service. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, if you believe truth can still triumph over lies, then don't let this moment fade into memory. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel. Join the movement to demand leaders who embody the values that make America worth fighting for. Because the fight isn't over, it's only just begun. And together, we can make sure dignity always wins.